And within the royal family, the most important thing was the maintenance of the bloodline. And how do you do that? Well, you keep it within the family. And so if we go back into Egypt, we find that sibling marriage was very common, almost mandatory. If we look at Akhenaten, for instance, Akhenaten married 2 of his daughters, maybe 3. It's possible that Nefertiti was his sister.
I thought she was his half-sister.
Yeah, she could have been a half-sister.
Yeah.
It's very confusing that era, so we're not quite sure, but certainly she would have been a close relative. If you come down into the Ptolemaic era, that's the era of the Greek pharaohs of Egypt. Of course, all of the Greek pharaohs of Egypt married a sibling of some nature. Cleopatra herself married 2 of her brothers. And so this was perfectly normal for the royal family, mandatory even, to maintain the bloodline in its purity. And that is why I say that Thea-Musa Orania was of the Egyptian royal line, because she was keeping the same consanguinity rules as they did in Egypt, which places her strongly within the Egyptian royal line. Now, we know this wasn't a Persian custom, because that is the reason they kicked her out of the country. So quite clearly, incest was not a Persian custom. It was Egyptian, and that's why I say she was Egyptian. And so that is the reason she was kicked out of Egypt. Now, this has a big bearing on Saul's
I was just going to
perspective.
say, in casting the Egyptians as the root of all evil.
Yes.
Okay.
And demonization, of course, of incest.
Right.
How do you eradicate a royal line? Well, you stop them doing their usual customs.
Right.
And one of the usual customs, of course, in the Egyptian royal line was incest. And if you make incest taboo, you've just ruined the royal family.
When you look at this as at pedigrees of other species, this is always what's done to keep the pedigree.
Yes,
Right.
indeed. It was a royal pedigree.
Right.
And it's still actually, and it's my belief, strong belief, that it is still carried out today. However, of course, to maintain the normal rules we have in our society, of course, all the marriages occur within close relatives, cousins.
Mm-hmm.
But you can still maintain the bloodline just by having 2 separate lines and marrying between cousins.
Right.
So I'm sure it's still carried out to some respects today.
So how does, now going back to the birth of Jesus?
Yes. Yes, so, well, we have our prince, and we have all the reasons for the New Testament story, why this prince was important, why he became a leader. And if we go back into the works of Josephus again, he says that at this very time a 4th sect of Judaism was set up. And so I don't think that Jesus was of the Essene sect.
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yes. There were 3 main sects, the Sadducees, the Pharisees and the Essene. But there was also a 4th sect. And I think Jesus was of this 4th sect. Because this 4th sect was very, very closely related to this area I'm talking about, to the east of the River Jordan, which was called Bethlehem.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, and that's probably where we get the biblical Bethany from. And this particular 4th sect maintained its own army, just as Thea-Musa Orania had her own army. And just as Jesus had his own army as well, and we'll come on to that in a little bit. So I think he was of this 4th sect of Judaism, and it's probably from this 4th sect that the Essenes were a later branch off from them. And the main concern of the 4th sect was taxation, because Thea-Musa Orania, when she set up her city-state, was given the lands tax-free. And the reason that was done, of course, was because she, with her independent army, could act as a mercenary army for Herod Archelaus.
Now, just
she, with her independent army, could act as a mercenary army for Herod Archelaus.
Now, just to set the record straight, you're talking about Mary, the one who would be known as Mary in the Bible?
I think it might have been Jesus' grandmother.
Okay.
I think there was probably another generation. So I think Mary herself was Theomusa Orania's daughter.
Okay.
So we're jumping one more generation.
Okay, all right.
And the daughter of Theomusa Orania was known as Julia Orania.
Okay.
She virtually had the same name. And that is the generation, I think, of Jesus. So she would have been Jesus' mother.
Okay. So I didn't mean to sidetrack you.
Yes, no, that's fine. It's a complicated history.
Yes, very complicated, but so I just want to keep a thread on it.
That's
So
right.
you're talking about taxation.
Well, we know that Jesus had a lot of problems with taxation. We know, the turning over the tables, etc., in the temple. But also, he was accused. One of the main accusations against him was that he consorted with publicans and sinners. Now, publicans has been very badly translated, because the word actually means tax collector. And so one of the main accusations against him was that he was consorting with tax collectors. So we know that one of the main problems that Jesus was having was over-taxation. And these people to the east of the River Jordan had this tax-free status. And that tax-free status was causing some friction. And they wanted to end it. And of course they didn't want it ended, because that's how they maintained their own private army.
Right.
And as I said before, Jesus also had his own army. Now, that might sound a little bit peculiar, but in order to find out these historical details about Jesus, we need to be able to find further texts, because the Bible doesn't give the full story. And surprisingly enough, there are other texts about Jesus. It's just that they are totally ignored. Where do we find these texts? Within the books of Josephus. Now, in order to clarify this, we need to know who Josephus was within the books of Josephus. Now, in order to clarify this, we need to know who Josephus was. Josephus was the army commander in command of Galilee, and he later became the primary historian of this era. And he wrote his own Old Testament and his own New Testament, effectively. So we have the complete history of Judea from Josephus. But who was he? Or rather, perhaps I should turn this around. Who was Saul? Here we have, Saul, we were talking about before, who was the founder of Christianity. He was the most important person, perhaps, in the last 2,000 years. And they've lost him. How do you lose all these important people from the historical record? I didn't believe that was true. It can't be true that we lose so many people. So I started to look for Saul within the historical record. And I suddenly found there were about 24 points of commonality between the life of Saul and the life of Josephus. And so I came to the conclusion in the end that Saul was Josephus, because they had the same goals, they had everything in common. They both wrote histories of the New Testament, of that era. But this is interesting because...
Yeah, wouldn't that make it slightly skewed if you say there was a specific agenda with Saul?
Well, there was, and he very much had his own agenda,
right.
Of course. And so
you're saying Josephus' agenda lines up with
absolutely.
Saul's? Okay.
Completely. They were both traitors to the system, effectively. They both changed sides twice. So Saul tried to join the Church of Jesus, and then was kicked out or whatever and went off on his own. He had his flash of inspiration on the road to Damascus. Because Saul was persecuting the Church of Jesus and James, of course.